All right, thank you, everybody. This is, I feel a little bit like Oprah Winfrey up here or something, but it's, thank you all for coming and for coming to the last panel and session of the day, and really appreciate you all wanting to be here for the conversation. My name is Tameshia Bridges Mansfield. I'm Vice President for Workforce and Regional Economies at Jobs for the Future. And so I'm really happy and excited to have this conversation and to have what is, I think, one of many conversations that's happening right now about job quality. This is not like the penultimate conversation, but we're just adding to the talk that is happening, the action that is happening, the thinking that is happening to compel various actors across the workforce and education ecosystem to begin thinking and then moving towards improving the quality of jobs for frontline workers across this country. So today, I'm joined by two awesome and fabulous people who I'm really excited to know. Steve Lee, who's the Executive Director of the Skill Up Coalition, and Ellen Frank Miller, who is Executive Director of the Workforce Organizational Research Center. And I always get it, like I always have to look and read it out because I know it is work. But that is an acronym that actually stands for something. And so I'm really excited to be here. So one of the things I just want to start off with is like, why is JFF having a conversation about job quality? And I think it's because it's one that we are increasingly recognizing as really important for the field and for the ecosystem to begin thinking about. And we recently released a job quality framework that you all can see on our website, but it really talks about what we see as like 4 key critical components to job quality, and then there's elements underneath it. We think that good quality jobs should have good compensation, should have a supportive structure, should have an agency and culture that supports workers, and that provides a range of opportunities for advancement for workers. And those are kind of the foundational pillars of how we think about job quality. And even as we've been preparing for this session and have been talking over time, recognize that there are other folks in the ecosystem who think about it as well. Steve and Ellen do as well. So sit back and listen for a little while. We'll leave some time at the end for questions and answers, but I'm going to kick it off with Steve. And if I can open up my deck. So Steve, one of the things that I'm really kind of excited to talk with you, and it was really great to learn more about the exciting work of Skill Up Coalition since its inception over the last few years, but can you share a little bit more about yourself and also share a bit about Skill Up and the journey really that your organization has been on since its inception during the pandemic?
Great, thanks Tameshia. Hi everyone, I'm Steve Lee. I work for the Skill Up Coalition. Before this, I worked in philanthropy for about 12 years in New York City. And if you think about Skill Up as like a digital aggregator, where people come to our site and then we send them into places that are looking to hire, train, or serve low-wage workers. That's basically our jam. And if I think about the two principles that we have that we think are really important, the first is to be data-driven, heart-led, and second is to be about the worker. And what that means from our platform experience is that we offer choice to workers. We treat them as consumers, right? Offering what we think is good choice, and then voice. We listen to them, and I'm going to talk a lot about what that means in terms of how we improve our efforts going forward. So how has this manifested itself since Scale Up launched in July of 2020 on the heels of COVID? There are, 12 million displaced workers. And I wasn't around at the time, but the founder said, we don't have time to wait. We just got to build the darn thing. So they just built they built a website. They got some partners, and they just built something because they needed to get folks hired into work. Fast forward a year later, the labor market had changed fairly significantly in just a year later. And workers were telling us, and we do spend a lot of time talking to workers and surveying, they said, listen, I need more than just a job, right? I need to upskill within a company. And so we just built the darn thing. We built something called Earn and Learn, where we work with partner employers that have these upskilling opportunities. Think of like, education as a benefit. And we just built the darn thing because we didn't have time to waste. Fast forward another year. It's summer of 2020. Unemployment's like 3%, right? So now workers, I want a career. I don't want just a job. I want a career. And so we completely changed our website experience. And then fast forward to where we are now, we're just relaunched a new product experience because what workers are telling us is, yes, I want a career, but I think I need some support services, right? So how do you build that into an experience, right? So we're starting to build that. I say all this because this idea about voice of the worker is really important, and everything they tell us is how we try to incorporate into the greater ecosystem. And so that's how we've evolved over the past couple of years, all anchored on the voice of the worker and to be heart-led, right? You're using data, obviously, but to be heart-led in listening to the voice of the worker.
And I think that's really unique. I think when we see websites and platforms, we're like, how do people actually tap into this and how do people actually use it and make sure their experience is actually being reflected in the work? And so I'm curious, as workers have expressed their needs have changed, I'm curious how you all have thought about the definition of a good job and how your definition and approach to job placement and job quality has also evolved over the last several years.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I think, when COVID hit and we just first launched, right? It was just about a job, right? And so as the evolution has happened in terms of how workers think about work and career, we've had to adjust along. And all the great work that JFF has done around these job quality frameworks, right, are kind of things that we use. And so we have 4 criteria for how we think about job quality. It's around access. It's about flexibility. It's about local living wage, right? Because living wages are different across the country. And how do you ensure you have local living wage? Because New York, where I live, is very different than even Austin, right? And then obviously advancement within a career. Those are 4 things we anchor on. And then we work with employers and workers to try to ensure that that stuff happens, right? And so I mentioned this idea of earn and learn. On the employer side, we're doing a lot more stuff around building off APIs and scraping the internet to see, what jobs, and then putting that into our job quality framework. So we surface many, many more jobs that are high quality, at least we think are high quality, by just scraping, right? And then lastly, on the employer side, you guys probably familiar with something called the American Opportunity Index, which was released about a month ago from Schultz Family Foundation. They have basically ranked all the top employers around how they think about work. And we're trying to build off that data set to offer our workers meaningful opportunities. And then the last thing I'll say is just on the worker side, right? Again, we need to listen to what the workers are telling us and make sure we build. Like for the recent data, there was an article about earnings, income increase over the past 2 years. The largest percentage increase has been for low-wage workers over the past couple of years, percentage-wise. And I think that says something. And how do we use that to incorporate into our experience I think will be important going forward.
Yeah, and I think to that point, it'd be really interesting to dive in a little bit more into who is using your platform, and then what are the jobs that you are seeing workers being attracted to based on what you are cultivating, based on your framework and how you think about good jobs.
Yeah, so the workers, our target population are those without college degrees earning under 40. So if you're familiar with the term STARS, which is a terminology through a partner of ours, Opportunity to Work, those are the ones we most try to reach. And if you think about the industries and the jobs, SkillUp only services basically 35 jobs in essence, because we've identified these 35, not 350, not 36, right, not 34, 35, right, that we think are the best based on some labor market analysis and stuff we do in-house. And these are the 35, right? And then we surface those on our website. And I would say 60% are healthcare and IT, right? Which makes sense because of the way the world's going. And obviously, the 4 criteria we set. But we also have some other industries. But we're very careful on what we select, right, on what we put on our site, because you don't want to have too much. And there really only is 35, right? At least currently, Tameshia.
Yeah, and so to get to that 35, then how do you go about validating, right, that the jobs and the employers are actually good jobs and good employers? Because I think a lot of people think about any job is a good job, or we look at this one little thing like wages, but you have several other areas that you look at. There's other areas that we look at as well. And so just how do you go about testing and validating and ensuring that the jobs and the employers that folks are being matched with meet the standard that you're looking for?
Yeah, in the background, we do a whole lot of homework, right, on the research side of things, looking at labor market data and things of that sort. And again, we have this framework we use, which is often mirrored off JFF's, around things like local living wage, right? Think about accessibility, flexibility. So we incorporate all those elements. And then we also, beyond just desk research, we actually talk to folks. So locally, what happens in Austin may be different than New York, and what's happening in the local ecosystem is very different. So we do a lot of homework on the back end to surface. And then we want to make sure that a partner, let's say employer, right, they have the same principles as we do, right? So things around upscaling, right, around flexibility, work, all those kind of things, we screen out. So we only have 20 employers we work with, right? And I think we turn away a few because they don't meet some of the criteria. We're very principled about that. And you have to be principled because the more stuff you have out there, the more sort of junk you might have out there. And so we want to make sure we have high quality, and there's a lot of work that happens in the background around that, Tameshia.
And I think that's super important. I think as we think about, like in our local economies and our local places, we think about employer partners. And
Right.
I think a lot of times systems think about serving like, oh, you need workers, we'll get you those workers. And we don't ask the back end questions, right? To say, but what is the quality of job that you're asking? And it does take that additional questioning and rigor and building really good partnerships with employers that are about both service and accountability on both sides. And that's not always easy, and it might make your ecosystem and the places that you work and partner with smaller,
Right.
but it also means that you're also providing the impact that folks want to have, and that's your ultimate end goal at the end of the day.
Yeah, we're trying. We're trying.
No, that's really great to hear. So Ellen, I'm gonna turn things over to you, and I think what I've appreciated about learning about your work over the time that we've been talking, even before this session, just as I think comrades and partners in this work over the years, is that you really think about what does it mean to bring research to action, right? And to be able to actually move the needle to what you call voluntary employer action on job quality. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about work and your approach to doing this.
Yeah, thank you. So I appreciate all of you being here. I'm Ellen Frank Miller. I'm founder and CEO of WORK, the Workforce and Organizational Research Center. A mouthful. So we are researchers who bring the evidence base into action, and I think it's important when we talk about quality jobs that we think about the role of public policy, which is foundational. Things like minimum wage laws, fair work week ordinances, they are absolutely mandatory, and in this country, we can't count on public policy to go far enough. So that leaves us with voluntary employer action. And there are limits to voluntary employer action, but we also know from research and from theory that there's a way in which new ideas, innovations, diffuse and spread themselves across that allows us to sort of predict where are we and what do we need to do to make things happen. So one of the things that is sad to say, but improving the quality of jobs at the bottom of the org chart is actually in our economy an innovation. It's this concept that maybe bottom level jobs, entry level jobs, can and should be good jobs. So if we look at that as an innovation, then we have something to work with. And if we could have our slide, please. So what you're seeing here is a chart that's based on Rogers' theory of diffusion of innovations. And what it tells us is that we can predict, based on where we are, what it takes to get the innovation to be adopted by the next group over. And you'll see on the left-hand side, there are 3 groups that we call innovators, early adopters, and the early majority. And on the right-hand side, there are 2 groups, the late majority and the laggards. So the innovators are the ones who hear about a new idea and say, that is cool, I'm gonna do that. The next group over, the early adopters, are the ones who say, that's kind of cool, tell me more about that. How does that work? How would I do it? And then they will adopt the innovation. The next group over, that early majority group, that's the group that says, that's interesting. Do you have data? Can you show me a case study? What are some success stories? How did that play out? And if persuaded, that group adopts. And you can see there's an arrow pointing to where there's a critical mass, and that is the tipping point. Once you have the early majority on board, you get over to the late majority where they look around and say, oh no, everybody's doing that thing. We're gonna have to do that thing too, or we'll be left behind. And the last group over are the laggards who come kicking and screaming, or they die. So our work in basically improving job quality, we're really in this early adopter stage. We can all probably think of some examples of companies that are doing a good job. Actually, the Opportunity Index is a good example, where there are companies that are embracing this and making frontline jobs better. So the key for us, is that the data that we need to move that early majority is where we can get it from is from the early adopters. So in our work, we do research and then help companies apply that research on the ground with that early adopter group to try to jump the chasm over to the early majority.
No, and I think I like this idea of like figuring out where you can go and hit and get the impact that you need. Like you don't have to like boil the ocean and reach every single employer. It's about being like targeted and strategic around who you think you can move the needle on. And I think it's also really fascinating. I'd be curious like how many people have been hearing conversations about job quality for like the last 10 or 15 years. So to think of it as like an innovation is like, is it an innovation? But in some ways, I think it really is, and I think the way you're approaching it is actually really smart and strategic, and appreciate kind of the thought that you've put behind it, so that you're using your time and your resources well to be able to move the needle that way.
And I think that really, it's a horrible thing to say, but the Great Resignation was like the best thing that ever happened to us at work, because suddenly companies were like, oh my gosh, these workers are essential and they're leaving. We must do something about this. We're like, we can help you with that. So this idea that somehow there was this awakening that making jobs better would actually be good for business, that's what makes me say I've been doing this for 30 years and it's finally coming around to where it's top of mind. Like this is actually a strategy that can make our business better.
No, I do think that the pandemic and everything around it was a wake-up call on a lot of opportunities to change. It's like, how do we harness that opportunity, like now 3 years later, to keep things moving and keep the needle going. So yeah, I'd be curious to know also a little bit for like the late majority and who are like, oh wait, I gotta do something. How do you think about pressure points, right? We talk a lot in markets about like how do you move people and what are the pressure points for movement. In your research and what you're seeing, like what are those things that compel workers or employers to make the changes, and where is the kind of like easiest entry point to get employers to begin moving the needle on quality?
Well, I'm glad that you brought up the fact about who is your audience and who do you go after. We don't bang our heads against the wall at work, and I know you all don't either. You look for the coalition of the willing and you start there and move forward. So we did some research for the National Fund for Workforce Solutions that was funded with generous contribution from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that was looking at how do we make small to mid-sized businesses, how do we activate them to make jobs better? And as part of that research, we looked at the motivations of the leaders of these small to mid-sized businesses that were participating in the research. So if they're participating in the research, they're in that early adopter category. And in trying to understand their motivations, we found that there were 3 novel findings. The first of which was they knew the realities of their workforce's lives. They knew their frontline workers, they knew what their workforce was all about. Even if they had 300 employees, they really had their finger on the pulse. The second thing was that they had personal values that basically put them in the place where they said, this is the right thing to do. That was actually the title of the conference paper that we presented at the Academy of Management, is it's the right thing to do. But the third factor, which was a novel finding that was really exciting, was that the key thing that moved them into action was knowledge of options. If they knew something that they could do to make jobs better, they would do it. And all of them referred to, when they learned about something, and that was why, then they thought that it would work for their workforce. So getting that information into their hands, bringing that knowledge of options is how we move those early adopters. Now, the thing about small to mid-sized businesses is they can make change much faster than large organizations. So the strategy there is if you get small businesses that are early adopters who can make change fast, it creates pressure. And especially in labor markets, for example, one of the companies was in Wichita. So it's a labor market that has, kind of a small pond. And if smaller businesses are doing something that makes it more difficult to compete for talent, larger companies start to feel pressure around, how they approach the jobs and the way that they're designed.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I think we sometimes don't think of small businesses as like an anchor to be able to move the needle on job quality, but I think in some ways they have some flexibility and ability to do it. It can be a challenge, right? But I think in local labor markets where they have to compete, where they are often civic leaders, like there's a different case, I think, to be made for small and medium-sized businesses to make the changes to improve the quality of their frontline workers. I'm curious, like, how you go about thinking about that case making with small to mid-sized businesses. Like, what is the thing that gets them excited to be like, oh, maybe if I change this thing, it'll address this pain point or something that I have.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as a small business at work, we really do understand that there are many constraints that small to mid-sized businesses are under. So we don't lead with wages and benefits. There are generally ways in which there are actual financial constraints that we are at a limit. Now, sometimes those things move once we start thinking more holistically, but the places that you can start are looking at practices, like, for example, how much autonomy do people have in their roles? How much can they determine how to get the job done in their day-to-day work? We know that from the research, the level of autonomy you have in your job is strongly correlated with whether you are engaged at work, whether you are planning to leave your job, whether you are burnt out in your job. And actually, we can have the second slide. These are the job quality maps that were, again, developed as part of the project with the National Fund for Workforce Solutions, funded by the Gates Foundation. And what we did here is we used the research literature to identify what are job characteristics that are strongly correlated with the workforce KPIs, turnover, engagement, burnout, et cetera, that we can use as levers. And you'll notice that there's a key there that shows us that not every job characteristic is connected to every outcome. So for example, you can raise wages, but that's not going to address burnout. And I actually had a bank executive say to me, well, when my team works really hard, we bonus them, and then it's all good. Well, if you work them really hard and they get burned out and you bonus them, there's no evidence that that's actually going to retain them. Benefits, on the other hand, are very strongly connected to retention. So as we work with these companies and we say, well, what are your primary challenges? Look at job characteristics that you have the ability to have control over, not all of which cost a lot of money to improve your practices, and start there. And start with a small win and then use that to build.
No, that's what great. I'm curious, Steve, from your perspective, as you're thinking about what you hear from the workers that access your platform, like, how does that then connect in terms of like things like autonomy, things like flexibility? What are some of the things you're hearing from the stories of the workers that you connect with that like rise to the top in terms of what they're looking for or why they're coming back into the labor market, and what are the things that they need that drive them back in?
I mean, I think it's many of the things that people already know, right? It's about compensation for sure. It's about flexibility, especially in 2/3 of, actually more, 3/4 of skill-up users are women, right? And so this idea of like flexibility and childcare things are really, really important. But what I'll also say is that workers are very different. Like what may be important for a worker who's a single mom in New York may be different from a single mom in Texas, right? And so how do we ensure that we listen, right? Really important. And then we surface, right, locally, a thing that's most important working with our partner employers, because again, there's no one set rule, right? And so we need to, as best we can, adjust, right, for the nuances of workers across America. That's what we try to do, right? Imperfectly, yes, but we try to do that as much as we can. Again, this idea of like anchoring really on the voice of the worker and then partnering with stakeholders to answer those questions is what we do. And yeah, I think it's effective, but it's tough. It is tough.
Yeah, and I think that like local context becomes really important. I think it's interesting for us as JFF, and I think for some of you all who are like national organizations, it's like, how do you make this make sense in your local labor market and to the needs of your local workers and to your local employers? Like at the end of the day, the job happens around the corner, down the street, in your local downtown. And so being really, really keenly aware of what those different needs and challenges, issues, wants, desires opportunities for both workers and employers becomes really important. I think sometimes what I've seen happen over the years is conversations around job quality become very much around, this is what the only thing that the employer needs to do. It's one thing that is important, and it's really a constellation of factors that when you put them all together, and it's a continuum. It's like work that happens over time that employers really invest in, that they listen to their workers and figure out ways to get touch points and opportunities to hear from them to continuously improve on the things that their workers need to stay, so to reduce turnover and maintain retention, and figure out how to attract workers over the long term. So it's not a silver bullet. It really is like constant attention and tuning to your labor market needs, to your worker needs, and frankly also to a business's bottom line.
Yeah, I'll add one thing is, for example, like education as a benefit it's like a thing, right? Then yet when you talk to skill-up workers, most of them don't know it exists, right? A lot of even if they do know it exists, like it's unavailable, right? Even for ones that the ones that know exist, and then life often gets in the way for low-wage workers, right? And so they can't take advantage of that class because they have to take care of their child. So there's so much nuance on this. And this idea of informing and providing the right information, I think, is really, really useful.
And I think another piece was you think about factors of job quality around like flexibility, autonomy, a regular schedule where a worker knows, like, I know I'm going to work these hours, I'm going to have these 20 hours, this is what the schedule is going to be. That then creates more ability and flexibility in their own lives to be able to take advantage of training opportunities and things like that, because the job is structured in the way that allows them to take advantage of advancement opportunities that are out there. One of the things, and I meant to ask this at the top, like this is an education conference, and you're like, why are we talking about employers and jobs? So I'm just curious in terms of taking a pulse of who is in the room. And I usually do this at the beginning, but I was a little bit nervous and forgot. So I'm gonna ask it now because I think one of the questions that we want to talk to, I think may speak to you all. I'm curious if you want to raise your hands, who in the audience is an educator, first from the K through 12 system? I can kind of see you, but if you can raise your hand. Okay, there's K through 12. And then any post-secondary educators? Okay, there we go. And then any community-based organizations, nonprofits? Cool, all right, government? And then y'all may not want to raise your hands. You could just give me a wink or a head nod. Any investors? Okay. Or philanthropy in the room? Great. And so it's really cool to see like this wide mix of people, because all of you all are part of the system and ecosystem that either invest in workers directly in terms of their skills and education as learners. You are employing people, you're providing wraparound supports. It really is a full system conversation as it relates to job quality. And so one of the questions that I have, and it's something that like I'm still figuring out, and I'm interested also from folks in the audience, is like, when you think about pressure points, what do you think the role is that education and training programs have in helping to move the needle on job quality? And I would love to kind of hear you all's thoughts and riffs on that.
Well, again, when we think about that model of, where are we at, and if we're in the early adopter stage, the communication channels are critical to get the word out about how these things work and the success that we're having. So any training and education partners that are connected to employers are, they have a direct line. So that's a wonderful way to sort of share the information with employers about, this is really solid information, solid research that shows that these are practices that can benefit your business and benefit your workers. So that relationship and the communication channel is really incredibly valuable.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I have three thoughts. The first is keep on doing what I think people are doing, which is ensuring that the training leads to the types of jobs we all care about, the high quality. And I think there's a movement afoot, right, to do that. And so I think that's fairly obvious. I think the other two are much more difficult. The first of those two is this idea of open and shared data. That is a tricky wicket in this business, right? People like to keep their own data, and there are good reasons for doing so, right? But unless we have some system of open and shared data, it's going to be hard to figure out what works and what doesn't work, right, across the whole ecosystem. And that is tricky. It's really, really tricky. But I'd love to see us think about how we have open and shared data. And the second is narrative change. Like, how do we take what we learn and craft a narrative of what that means in a way that's different, right? That's unique, because everyone's talking about job quality, right? But how do you create like a unique voice, right, in this? And maybe it's a worker voice. I don't know what it is, but having some narrative change to push, I think, is really important. But the second one, I think, is the most important one, like shared data, but it's tricky.
I think that is hugely hard, I think, because as you think about what the incentives are in workforce and education, it's placement, right? And it's a job, full stop, right? Yeah. And so there is less of an incentive to be like, but is it a good job, and what kind of job, and what is like how long are people staying in those jobs? And it's, I think, one of the things that I think about when I think about data is there's a certain level of bravery and vulnerability in collecting data, because that's hard, right? There's a level of vulnerability in looking at your data, regardless of what it is, whether it's job quality data, whether it's equity data, and seeing like where folks are landing in your training and education programs based on the type of job. Because when you start looking at that data, it opens up racial equity questions around occupational segregation. Like, when you look at data, you have to sometimes confront what you're doing well, right? And then what you're doing not well. And so there's a huge level of vulnerability that's involved in it. And I think there's also like a huge level of curiosity, because then once you look at where what you're doing well that you can celebrate and continue replicating, you can also get into the solution business also in terms of saying what's not working and start thinking more creatively about like how do you find the solutions and the things that we haven't really thought of to address this pain point that the data is looking at. And so I know that's something that we think about a lot at JFF through Equos and some work that we're doing around how do we begin to really look at and measure the outcomes of education and training programs, particularly when you look at short-term credentials, to make sure that the needs of workers, that the needs of employers are met, and that there's really clear outcome data on the other side, not to penalize folks, right? But really to think about how we use data as a mechanism of continuous improvement for our programs, but also for the people that we're ultimately in the business of serving. So I appreciate you kind of lifting up the data and like research element of that. I'd be curious also from you, Ellen, as a researcher, like how do you get employers to share and look at their data? Like, I think we've just thrown out like education needs to look at their data, but like how do you get employers to like actually do that? And like what is a lesson that can come from that for educators as well?
Very, very carefully. So what I think is, again, I keep going back to the Rogers model. When you have the innovators, they are the trailblazers, and they want to share their data. And if you think, so I'm going to take the impact investing world as an example. There are a small handful of firms that are innovators that are approaching investing with a job quality lens. They have the investment thesis that if we work with our portfolio companies to make jobs better, the portfolio companies will be more successful, and we, the investors, will make more money. They are evangelists, and they are sharing data about their success and how they're approaching this work. So the key is to find the employers who really believe in the thesis and really want to advance the effort. And then, of course, as researchers, we take confidentiality and anonymity extremely seriously, and we adhere to very high standards. And I think that's really crucial. There are some companies that are like, no, put my name on that. And then we will. But really building the trust and the relationship and finding the right folks who have an interest in advancing the practices. When we talk about, mentioned healthcare, in the Chicago area, we're doing research with 4 large hospital systems that are trying to build career pathways for frontline healthcare workers. They all have the same problem. They all have the same trouble recruiting. They all have the same problem retaining. We're working with all of them. We're surveying employees. Surveys are in the field right now. Each employer will get to see their survey results for their employees. We will also aggregate those data, de-identify it, and then report back to this collaborative of healthcare employers to say, here are the findings across this healthcare ecosystem, because that can help everybody. So by working with employers and giving them data about their company, their organization that can be valuable to them, and then aggregating data in an anonymized way that keeps things confidential but can benefit the larger ecosystem, that's another strategy.
I'll also add that stuff like we talk about the American Opportunity Index and stuff like Just Capital is doing, like, again, open sourcing using real data, right, to suggest that some companies are doing better than others, yeah, I think can be a game changer. It's not a blame or shame game. It's just opening up, what companies are really doing using real data, and then using it as a mechanism to try to improve the system at large.
And I think making that data also transferable and transparent to workers, right? And helping workers understand, like, how do I identify what's important to me in a job? And then how do I look at this data so that it's not just like, everybody looking at their own data and figuring it out, but how do you make it relevant to workers and job seekers and learners to help them assess and understand what is really the best pathway for me that's gonna meet the needs and the boxes that I have for myself, for my family, for my needs. So it's like this really interesting web of using data for quality improvement, for educating end users, which in this case are workers, and then also to help kind of compel or move the needle for employers to think about their practice change. And I think there's also something interesting about getting employers to work together. So we do a lot of work with sector partnerships and things like that, because there's also a certain level, there's both competition when you bring employers together, but there's also a certain amount of safety when they're all sharing some of the same pain points. They don't feel quite so alone in it, and they can come up with better shared solutions that they can work through and think through how to help and build together as well. So I'm looking at the time. Oh gosh, this has gone a lot faster than I thought it would. So one of the things I think I want to open it up, I'm going to open it up a bit to some audience questions because we've talked a lot at y'all. And then I'm going to end it with a couple of, I'm going to throw some new, well, I've already thrown some new questions, but I'm going to keep throwing one last new question for y'all at the end. But would be curious, as we've been sitting here having this lovely conversation with ourselves, what questions you all, goodness, it's like, how do people do this in their lives? What questions folks may have from the audience that we can do our best to answer. So there's someone right there. And if you can say your name, and if you're comfortable, this is recorded, if you're comfortable, you can say the name of your organization. You don't have to if you don't want to.
No, that's fine. My name is Clyde Boyer. I'm CIO of Trinity Education Group. There's two questions. First one is from the K-12 and from the supply side. How can we better align, especially with regional development, this kind of addressing the skills and demand gap? It seems like we haven't clearly articulated what skills are required for, what the regional plans are, and then how does that trickle down to whether it's higher ed, CTE, and then K-12, and ensuring that supply meets the skills demand within a particular area.
Do you want to talk through that? Because that's largely kind of some of the bread and butter of what you all do at Skill Up. Yeah,
I think it's a tricky question to answer. We do our best, direct to consumer, right, to try to identify what are the skills, right, that people have, and then what are the skills that employers need in order to hire these folks. But I will say that it's tricky because there's usually a skills gap, and even when we send people to one of our main calls to action is sending people to training programs or education providers to get those trainings to get the right skill sets. Even then, there's often a skills gap, and so listen. It's what we do, but it's really challenging. And I'm not a K-12 expert, and so I don't really have any good insights like how this bleeds into K-12. But this idea of skills assessment is not something new. People are doing it. But to do it really well, I think takes a level of relatively sophisticated technology, et cetera, to really, really do well. And there are lots of companies who are doing this stuff. We do our best, but it's tricky. And K-12, I can't answer that, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I would say, goodness, I think part of it is being really attuned. One, it's partnership, right, and being really attuned to what are the are the needs and the skill development opportunities that workers need. I think the other piece of it also comes into like really tapping into people's interests, particularly young people and children's interests at an earlier age, to be like, here are the opportunities that are there for you, and really kind of doing some of that exposure. I think it's the work you all do, right? It's like, how do you do early exposure to career pathways? How do you do all that? But I think there's also a piece of kind of understanding where the gaps stem from, and also understanding that some of the gaps that people have larger and other systemic issues that also have to be untapped to be able to actually help people and young people take advantage of the opportunities that they have and really maximize the skills that they have. And that is a longer game that isn't just about training. It's understanding what some of those other issues are and how do you find the right services, whether it's wraparound supports, whether it's policy change, whatever it is, to be able to get those issues and those barriers addressed so that folks can take advantage of the opportunities that are there. And what I actually really think is like the intrinsic value and interest and curiosity that people have to want to learn and to want to contribute. And sometimes things get in the way, and you have to kind of figure out what those things are. And I hope that was helpful. Any other questions? There's one right here. I just see a pink shirt and a mask.
I am, in fact, mostly composed of a pink shirt and a mask. My name is Ramel. I work with an organization by the name of Youth Force NOLA in New Orleans, and we generally work with rising seniors, so we'll call it 11th through 13th grade, because we have a lot of students in transition, especially given the pandemic and the outcomes there and challenges there. The question I'm posing to you all as the panel has to do with getting students the technical skills, even the durable skills, getting them into positions in high-wage, high-demand areas. But the challenge we've seen at times, and I'm wondering if you've had the same one with young workers, is companies are invested in talent, but perhaps aren't invested in DEI or environments that are retaining the talent they're recruiting, and how you've grappled or dealt with that, and frankly, if you've seen that to be the case in your work as well.
So I will say, I'm trying to think what to say about this. There's a lot to say. As we think about the job framework that we have, a big piece of it is around agency and culture, right? Because that is something that organizations have to have a laser focus and attend to it on a regular basis and have a solution around it. I think one of the ways that we think about it at JFF is related to what we have is our impact employer model, where we think about what are all of the things from total rewards to your culture to how you engage in community that makes someone a good employer. But it is like, it has to be something that employers think about, work towards, have a plan for from day one, and are continually doing it. I think we're in this really interesting time where we're trying to like recruit diverse talent to bring folks in. And I'm not always sure how much attention is being paid to making sure that it is a welcoming environment, right, for young people, for people of color, for immigrants, for women, and that all of that is equally as important as what you do to get people in the door. And so I think we're in this really interesting moment where like DEI isn't just about like what we can put on our website or what we can like kind of toot our horn to, but I think employers and workers are feeling the pain point when it doesn't match up. And I think folks are becoming a lot more curious and I think intentional around what is it that we can do to make the changes that we need to make. But it doesn't always happen. But I think it has to be a motivation, and it has to be something that folks pay attention to from the C-suite on and are making the continual investments on a regular basis. I'd be curious with the folks that you work with, like how that comes up.
Yeah, so I think I would agree. And this idea of it doesn't match up, right? There's idea of like there's a dissonance, right, between what and the rhetoric that sometimes employers are saying and what workers really feel, right? Now, I'm a big cynic when it comes to DEI. Like, I think companies do it for reasons which are not always so great. I'm just being honest about that. And yeah, I do think there are the more employers to think about it. When you talk to a worker, they come across, they butt heads, right, against ultimately the hiring decision, right? Where it just comes down to company, I didn't hire the best person. And I get that sometimes, right? And often it's not what they say around DEI. And so workers are telling us that. I will say that there's a slow trickle, right, to making improvements. I think hopefully it'll become more than a trickle. But right now it's still a trickle because I think there's a mismatch, right, between the rhetoric sometimes and the realities of workers are telling us. And the workers are telling us that there's a mismatch.
Yeah, and I'll just add too that the rhetoric serves a purpose for us, right? Like the minute you put that out there that we have these DEI goals and we are committed to meeting them, now there's some accountability out there. You cannot achieve your DEI goals if the lower level jobs in your company are lousy. You can't. You cannot do it. So if you want to reach your DEI goals, because in general, lower level jobs tend to be more likely to be workers of color and women, and you have talent in your organization. So if you're not looking at the quality of those jobs, retaining workers in those jobs, and finding a way to advance them, you will not find yourself achieving your DEI goals. So it's a way to enter a conversation to say, this is a key priority for you. Clearly, you've said that, and you're trying a variety of strategies. Talk to me about what you're doing for, we had a conversation with someone who said they spoke to a large grocery chain that said, but our workforce is incredibly diverse. We have, majority workers of color. It's like, right, and they're all in, stocking the shelves in the stores. What are you doing to leverage that talent and to advance them? So as long as you have bad jobs at the bottom, you're not going to reach those goals.
And I think one of the things that we think about at JFF from an advancement perspective, and even naming advancement as a part of our job quality framework, is that recognition that you have to think about not only how you are solving for that mismatch to be able to have a welcoming culture and environment, but then what are the mechanisms that employers have in place to actually upskill their staff. You have to do both, right? Because the true story is, everyone who is a frontline staff person isn't going to automatically catapult to the next position. There aren't enough jobs to move people up. So you have to pay attention about the experience and the quality of the job at the entry level so that folks have an opportunity to either skill up in that organization or even to skill out. But you have to pay attention to that. Otherwise, organizations are continue to have turnover. You as a service provider are like, what am I doing to actually help the young people that I'm actually working with to actually fulfill the promise of what your mission and your organization wants to do? And part of it may even be, and you may be able to do this, is having some of that real talk with your employer partners and figuring out who in your community can be a solution source to help them address their pain point. Because if you have employers coming to you to say, we want to hire your staff, you have an interesting power position to be like, sure, you can hire our staff, but here's some of the things that we also look for, and maybe here is a partner in our community that can help you get there, or we can talk about what that means. And so it becomes a different partnership conversation that opens up a piece for accountability, for partnership, for bringing in new people to the table. But for you as a service organization, you're always thinking about the needs of your staff or the needs of the participants of your program, which is the thing that you are charged with doing. See, before I ask, does anybody else have their hand up back there? No? Okay, I can't see. We'll come and get you. I knew there were people back there, but I can't see.
Thank you. Hi, thank you. My name's Aaron Miller. I work for a talent organization in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I'm curious about, we hear from employers all the time that they have trouble navigating all the training options in their own communities, and I think Skill Up is a really interesting solution to help route people to the right place, both employees of an organization, but also employees or workers who are not employed. And I'm curious what you've seen in scaling that ability to help route people to the right training program that gets them to high quality jobs.
It's a great question. It's what SkillUp tries to do as a sort of a national technology platform. But the tricky wicket is there are tens of thousands of programs across the country, right? A lot of them aren't so good. And so what we try to make sure we do is have this balance between quantity and quality. And so we surface 400 or 500 of them, right, that we think are really best in class based on how we have the criteria around that. So that's our aim, is to try to scaling it, right, is to identify the really, really good partners across the country that are either asynchronous, no matter where you are, or synchronous if you happen to be in a local community that we serve. And so we try to create that scale as best we can. But at the same time, we want to make sure that people are going to good programs, right, and not programs that are going to not get people the high-quality jobs we care about. And so I think there's a tension point. I think other people are thinking about it as well. We're not the only game in town, right? There are others who are thinking about this, the idea of surfacing training programs. And I think what SkillUp does well, I think, is that we're actually a coalition. That's actually our official name. And so we don't care like who does it. If we can work with others, right, to be able to scale something efficiently, I think that's what we try to do. And so we're one of several that does it. We'll work with others that do it. You know, I think we can get to a scalable mechanism, but only surface the ones that we think. This idea about quality, right, is coming quite a bit. Make sure we have high quality training programs, high quality employers, high quality jobs, all the high quality stuff. And you can't just have everything. So that's at least that's how we think about it.
And I think the quality piece does, I'm like going like this to you. I think the quality piece does like really extend across the board. I think the quality aspect of training and credentials are important because there are so many out there. And I know that's one of the things at JFF that we're really kind of thinking about as we kind of continue to iterate and really begin to build out our program, or not program, our work around equals, which is around quality outcomes, educational quality outcome standards. I got that right. I'm looking at my colleague Equos. That is really about like what are the different levers of quality of training programs to begin doing that assessment and really taking a coalition of the willing, right, who want to go through an assessment and a rigorous process to see where they land on that scale. So it goes back to data. And I think the way you get to that data conversation is you get to that data conversation around partnership and around the end users, in this case, which is the workers and the learners, and making sure that their needs are met. And being really carefully attuned to making sure that they feel like they are having a quality experience in training and education and a quality outcome on the other side that then employers can validate because folks they know are coming to their jobs with the right skills that are matched. So I think it is very much an ecosystem play, and I think we don't put enough value on the experience and the outcomes of workers themselves. We put a lot of value, not that it's bad, on employers saying, well, we can't find workers with skills, but our workers really, or our learners really going into programs that are going to give them the experience that they want, that they can come out on the other side of. I think she has a...
Hi, Allison Lands. I'm happy to be preempted by Aaron Miller anytime. I work for Skyhive Technologies. I share Stephen's cynicism or his sort of skepticism about some of the intrinsic motivators on the corporate side of the house and some of the incentives that are in place. And I come from the economic development world, so I can validate some of the skepticism in that world. But I'm wondering, we've talked a lot, and I think there's been a big emphasis on partnership, ecosystem building, the carrots of how we surface quality and how we emphasize the double bottom line wins that happen when you have good job quality. But conversely, the low road employers who are creating poor quality jobs and churning through workers in their local ecosystems are actually experiencing like what we in economics call like an externality. They're getting to sort of take a chunk out of that worker and a chunk out of the quality of the labor shed in general, and therefore the regional economic competitiveness. And they're not incurring any of those real costs. They're sort of externalizing them to the rest of the community. And in the meantime, they're hiring 10,000 workers, but they're churning 4. And I'm wondering if there's been any conversation. We've talked about carrots, but we also know that there's been a whole lot of like, the SEC tries to track people metrics now. There's really lax reporting and accountability on that. To what extent have we or any of your organizations explored or talked about potential sticks?
Yeah, so I will I'll start with that. So I don't know. I feel brave today. But so as I think one of the things we think about with the job quality framework that we have at JFF is that it's not only reliant on employer practice change, right? It also recognizes that some of the things that we need to to make the elements of a good job real takes policy action, right, and policy enforcement. And sometimes those are the most effective sticks or incentives that are in place. And I think that's something that we actually have to pay attention to, because one of the ways to get to scale, one of the levers of scale is policy change and enforcement. And I think we have to pay attention to that, whether it's in local economies. So you've seen like a wave of movement around fair scheduling, right? You've seen a wave of ordinances around, we've seen living wage stuff forever, but this new kind of rise around what does it mean to have a fair wage ordinance in place that applies to all employers, that's a really interesting incentive or stick when you have the right kind of enforcement mechanism behind it. So I think policy is a really interesting, I'm not gonna say stick, I'll say motivator, right? And sometimes it can be a stick in there to compel by requirements for employers to behave differently. I would also say the other piece in the way we think about another lever to job quality is really around worker-led initiatives, right? So it's like, what does a stick look like that is worker-led? Right, that is about the voice of community and kind of how do you build power, how do you do all that work to create a different type of narrative change, incentive, whatever you want to call it, to create that additional kind of bottom-up pressure on employers, on policymakers, on ecosystem actors to move the needle. So I think to create those additional motivators, it is about policy. It is about, there is a piece of power building. There's a huge role that I think industry actors play as well around setting, even if it's verbal benchmarks, to say, for this industry, we believe this is a benchmark for jobs in this industry, and that then becomes another really interesting motivator, stick, what have you, that creates kind of a bit of a buzz within an industry for folks to kind of act right, show up differently within their ecosystem. So I think it's about how do you get to employer voluntary action is one piece. But I think policy is another piece too that I think you have to put on the table to be able to make that happen.
Yeah, and I'll say that, at work, we operate in the realm of voluntary employer action, and on an annual basis, our staff reads a book chapter from my dissertation advisor, which is entitled "The Limits of Voluntary Employer Action," and we read that to keep ourselves honest here, because as you were saying, policy plays an incredibly important role. So when I was in graduate school and we were doing research on scheduling practices in retail and how to make those more stable and more predictable for the benefit of workers, but also for businesses, there were companies that were really working on how do we do this. The model of retail is, well, we need to balance, labor in the store versus, customers in the store. We're trying to optimize for that, and it results in all kinds of crazy, business practices as though workers are widgets and don't have lives. And it got to a point where it was completely out of hand. The employers are engaged in the research with us, really trying to crack this nut. Well, that research that was done by Susan Lambert at the University of Chicago, forms the foundation for every Fair Work Week ordinance in this country. And every company that we were doing research with was ready for that. So when you are a voluntary actor and then you get regulation, you're ahead of the game. All the other players in the field have to suddenly jump and adapt. And how do we do scheduling? We can't give schedules 2 weeks in advance. Yeah, you can. Those guys do it. You can do it too. So the element of you can do this voluntarily, and if you don't, you might get forced to do it. So it's probably easier if you figure it out before it's a law.
I'll just add that, Tameshia, policy is the golden ticket. But people vote with their feet, right? And so in order to do that, at least I think there needs to be some kind of narrative push, right? And it's one of the reasons, if you guys are familiar with tear the paper ceiling, one of the things I like about it, right, is this idea of how do you create some narrative change around how employers are thinking about workers and vice versa. I think personally, I think you got to have that because again, people are going to vote with their feet, and that's how you create policy change.
So we have reached our hour. So I know, whew. So I just want to really thank Steve and Ellen for this conversation. This was a lot of fun for me. I always like hearing what other folks are thinking and also what folks are doing. And also just really want to thank you all for sticking with it, for asking us really good, important, kind of hard questions for us to grapple with. That's actually the piece that makes being up here on a panel fun, because sitting here talking for an hour at people is not fun for anybody. So thank you all
Thank you, guys.
for coming.
Thank you all so much.